look at early brass instruments. The brass family was really the slowest developer amongst all the early instruments. For a start, the medieval ancestors of the modern horn, trumpet and trombone weren't always made of brass. Many other materials were used for their construction, including other metals, ivory, horn, and even wood. You can find primitive examples of early brass instruments all over the world today. For instance, this cow horn, which comes from Mexico. Or for a wooden instrument, this rather splendid wooden trumpet from New Guinea, which you have to blow in the side. In primitive societies, the trumpet has just the same sorts of associations that it has always done in our own. An instrument for kings and princes, and the herald of war. But the earliest brass instruments were tremendously limited in the actual notes they could play. Some of them were restricted to just one rather splendid note. That long trumpet comes from Tibet, where it's still used in Buddhist ceremonies. And some medieval trumpets were rather like that too, just playing a single low drone note. It wasn't until the 16th century that brass players regularly produced the sort of fanfares which we take for granted today. Let's have a look at the trumpet which played the top part in that toccata. It's very different from the modern trumpet. For one thing, the trumpet of Monteverdi's time had a much longer tube, about 8 feet long as opposed to 4 feet on the modern one. But the most obvious difference is that on the old trumpet there aren't any valves. The player had to do all the work with his lips, using the natural or open notes of the harmonic series. These are the notes which you can get from any decent length of tubing, from a bugle to a hose pipe. As you can hear, the lower notes in the series are rather far apart, the sort of thing we associate with simple bugle tunes. The higher up you go, the closer they are, but the harder they become to obtain just because the difference in lip pressure or embouchure is very slight. Producing the very high notes on the trumpet became a specialized technique, sometimes known as the clarino technique. It started around about 1600 in the time of Monteverdi and became one of the main features of the music of Purcell, Bach and Handel. But there was certainly nothing like it in the Middle Ages, when both the music and the instruments were much simpler. That fanfare was unusual because it's one of the few medieval fanfares to have been actually written down. Trumpeters, like most instrumentalists in those days, didn't actually read music at all, and so the traditions of playing had to be passed down from one generation to the next. When Monteverdi published his toccata in Orfeo, he was breaking entirely new ground, and the trumpet guilds weren't at all pleased to find a fully written out fanfare and all their secrets appearing in print. As far as the Middle Ages is concerned, we really have to guess just what medieval trumpeters played. One fascinating suggestion comes in a Gloria by the Burgundian composer Guillaume Dufay. It's called Gloria ad modum tubae, Gloria in the manner of a trumpet, and the two instrumental parts consist of a splendid antiphonal fanfare. longer trumpet of the Middle Ages was called the buizine, though the normal material was metal rather than wood. Those two wooden instruments are folk survivals from Sweden, where they're still made and played by Swedish shepherds. The long trumpets were ideal for ceremonial music. Several buizine players with standards flying from their instruments made a splendid impression on the eye as well as the ear, a fact which kings and princes were quick to appreciate. Trumpets became the prerogative of the nobility. Trumpeters, together with their attendant drummers, were an essential part of every royal household. They acted as heralds on all public occasions, travelled in the royal retinue, and occupied a more elevated social position than most other professional musicians. In one sense, the medieval trumpet's limitations were its virtue. It was isolated from all other instruments. But as far back as late Saxon times, men had already started to look for some way of filling in those gaps in the natural harmonic series. In fact, the whole history of early brass instruments really consists in the different attempts that were made to solve the problem. The first attempt consisted of combining brass techniques with the finger holes of a woodwind instrument. Finger holes were added to the cow horn as early as the 10th century. 3 seems to have been the most usual number, making possible a series of 5 or 6 consecutive notes, enough for simple melodies. But the instrument certainly was rather limited, and the maker, of course, had no control over its basic pitch because he was just stuck with the shape and dimensions of the original cow. So, at some stage, towards the end of the Middle Ages, makers changed from horn to wood. That's the tuohitorvi, a Finnish folk instrument which gives us some idea of what the medieval cornet was like. It's made in 2 halves, hollowed out lengthwise, and then glued and bound together with bark. There are 5 finger holes and a thumb hole. A shallow cup mouthpiece is carved at one end, and there's a piece of horn at the other to remind you of its cow horn ancestry. Later on, we'll see the sophisticated Renaissance cornet, of which this was the prototype. But for the moment, here's another piece by the monk of Salzburg, who provided us with several numbers in a rather rough and ready, one might say, folk style, appropriate to the newly developing brass family. This one's called the Trumpet, and, as the monk said, it's good for blowing. One can't help admiring the inventiveness of the medieval mind in the way they coped with the restricted compass of brass instruments. The cornet prototype provided one solution by basically shortening the tube with a series of finger holes. The other answer was to lengthen the tube by adding a slide. During the later Middle Ages, the buizine had grown longer, and in order to avoid an instrument of inordinate length, it had been reformed into a flattened S shape. The fact that the tube of the buizine was cylindrical made possible the idea of adding a telescopic mouthpipe, so that the player could steady the mouthpiece against the lips with one hand and slide the whole instrument in and out along the mouthpipe with the other. Well, the theory behind this invention was brilliant, but in practice, the slide trumpet must have proved tricky to handle. The moving section is so much heavier than the slender mouthpipe that an over-hasty return to first position can actually knock the player's teeth out. Difficulties are increased by the fact that, as the mouthpipe is a single one, the slide positions are uncomfortably long. Fast passages do involve some quite unwieldy stretches. Now here's that same passage played this time on the sackbut. With its double slide, each slide position is roughly half the length of those on the slide trumpet, and the problem of balance is solved too. The sackbut is simply a rationalization of the slide trumpet principle. And once it was established at the end of the 15th century, it's changed very little since. We now call it the trombone, but it's details rather than principles which have altered. The modern orchestral trombone has a slightly wider bore, a much bigger bell, and a few more bits of tubing. But the technique and method of sound production are identical. Now, the sackbut, like every self-respecting Renaissance instrument, developed into a family of different sizes, from alto down to bass. During the 17th century, the tiny soprano sackbut was added to complete the consort. The soprano sackbut provides the opposite problem from the slide trumpet. Here, the slide positions are terribly small, and all the notes are so close together that the player scarcely has to move his hand at all. During the Renaissance, the proper treble for a group of sackbuts was either the shawm or the cornet. The name cornet, cornetto in Italian, means little horn, but the finely wrought cornet of the Renaissance is a long way from its simple animal horn ancestor. It was certainly a beautiful instrument to look at, and as one Italian put it at the end of the 16th century, cornets are held the most excellent of the wind instruments in the profession. During their heyday, roughly 1500 to 1650, they were in demand for music of all kinds, indoors and outdoors, in serious music and dance music, in church and chamber, in the town bands and in the royal households. The cornet was incredibly versatile. It could play as loudly as the trumpet or as softly as the recorder. It could outshine the violin in brilliant divisions or sing like a human voice. No other instrument has quite the same vocal quality. As the French writer Mersenne put it at the beginning of the 17th century, it's like a ray of sunshine penetrating the gloom and darkness. That was the most common size of cornet, with roughly the same sort of range as the violin. It's made out of two halves of wood, glued together and planed to this beautiful eight-sided shape, with the outside usually covered in black leather. And there are other sizes of cornet too, like this tiny cornetino or the larger alto and tenor instruments. The tenor cornet is sometimes called the lizard because of its wiggly shape. As the tube gets longer, you simply can't reach all the finger holes otherwise. And so the largest member of the cornet family, developed about 1600, is positively serpentine in shape. And the voice of the serpent continued to be heard right up to the end of the 19th century, long after the cornet had fallen out of use. Wagner wrote for it, Thomas Hardy mentions it, and it was regularly used in the church and military bands. But here to end today's programme is the joyful sound of a Renaissance band.